Let me welcome you to our Changemakers series here at Geetham University, Dr. Swaminathan. Just for the audience who's joined us today, our students, our faculty and others, the last year and a half has been very, very difficult for all of us, as we all know, for the entire world, the pandemic, which has changed our lives completely and continues to do so with no clear end in sight. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has really been at the forefront of this fight against COVID. And one of the organization's most visible faces in that fight is its chief scientist, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who is joining us here at Geetham University this evening. She's been known for her pioneering work in TB and HIV research before that. Dr. Swaminathan was born in Chennai, one of the three daughters of educationist Meena Swaminathan and well-known agricultural scientist M.S. Swaminathan. Today, we have the privilege of talking to her about her remarkable journey, which has made her an inspiration, particularly for women, I think, who want to make science a career. I think that Dr. Swaminathan is truly an inspiration for all of us. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. Let me begin by asking you that, you've been dealing with COVID as a scientist at the WHO for a year and a half now, but how has the pandemic changed you or affected you personally? I'm not asking you as a scientist, but how it's changed your outlook, what lessons perhaps you've drawn from it.
Thank you, Nidhi. And first of all, a pleasure to be with all of you today. That's a very interesting question. And I think pandemic has, I'm sure, affected and changed all of us in one way or another. I think for me, a few key takeaways and a few lessons for the future that I will take into my work, hopefully, at the WHO and beyond, will be, first of all, really to say that, the centrality of health to everything else that we aspire to do is so important, and why it needs to be really at the focus of countries' decision making. Every decision that's made in every sector, I think, impacts health in one way or another. And it's often called, health impact assessment of projects and so on. And it's not really given, I think, the consideration it deserves. And so whether it's environmental policies or whether it's, buildings, or whether it's about making roads, constructing new roads, urban planning, even the smart cities that we have, I think unless they put the health of people in the center of planning, we are going to make mistakes again in the future. And not necessarily, similar kind of pandemics, but we are going to have health impacts that we don't anticipate and think about. So I think really every decision that's made and every investment that's made, I think we need to think about, are we considering the health effects, and also making like positive. One is to consider the health effects of other decisions in other sectors, but the other one, of course, is investing in health itself, and not just in terms of building more hospitals or health facilities, but looking at all of those upstream factors that impact our health. Most important, of course, is drinking water, sanitation, the purity of the air that we breathe, and the diets that we consume. These are what, ultimately impact our health. And if we don't address those, we're going to pay higher and higher and higher costs at the tertiary care level, because we're going to end up with those conditions which then need treatment. So for me, it's brought back the importance. The second one is the interaction of human beings with nature and environment, particularly as it relates to deforestation, to human-animal conflict, to urbanization, without consideration for the other species, plant and animal species that cohabit on the planet. We see what plastic is doing to our oceans, and we see also how nature is responding and reacting, whether it's climate change or whether it's the deforestation that we do. We can expect more viruses to jump from animals to humans if we continue at this same speed at what we've been doing. Thirdly, I think to me it brings really the importance of global collaboration to address some of the big global challenges that we have. We cannot do it country by country. We have to do it together because science and technology is now available. The tools are available. We can find solutions to many of the problems we face. But I think where we need is collaboration and solidarity in implementing those solutions. And unless everybody cooperates, we are not going to look at vaccines, for example. We have vaccines that were just developed at unprecedented speed. And today we're in a situation where those tools have been developed by the scientists, but there's been no global agreement on how those tools will be shared equitably and fairly around the world. So I think those are my takeaways. And of course, personally, I think I've lost also a lot of my very close friends, healthcare professionals who've lost their lives, while they're carrying out their professional duties. And healthcare workers have put themselves in the front line really as a firefighters in this pandemic and have sacrificed themselves. So we need not only to invest more in healthcare workers, but also it reminds us that, the life is also very, very ephemeral and temporary, and we're here for a while and we don't know when that life will be ending. And so we need to do our best for the world while we're here.
Absolutely. I know there are lots of questions our participants have about the pandemic, and so do I, which I'll come to in a bit. But we just wanted to get to know you a little more. And if I could ask you a little bit about, your childhood and your influences, and how your parents, the kind of role they played in encouraging you to take up a career in science. What was that like? I mean, you come from a very eminent family. And I'm sure your parents played a big role in encouraging you to become the person that you are today and the career choice that you made.
So I grew up, of course, in a household and an environment which had a lot of scientists and students. So I grew up on a campus that was an agricultural research institute. And our home always had students coming to discuss their thesis, but also students who came to seek advice, counsel from my parents, guidance, and they were like surrogate parents to many students who were living on the campus, both from India and from other parts of the world. So very mixed group of people. But right from my early childhood days, I was used to going to the lab to see experiments, to hear about experiments and research. Those words were used a lot. Also, my mother was an educationist, and so her focus was on preschool education, young children, and particularly children who come from deprived and marginalized communities like migrant workers and the migrant, especially the labor who built construction, who are at construction sites. And I got exposed also to the perhaps subconsciously to knowing about the inequities that exist in Indian society. And what you could do to actually make a positive difference in the lives of those children and those women, the working women who had nowhere to leave their children till creches were set up by my mother and her colleagues, where the children could not only be safe, but they could receive both nutrition and early childhood education. So for me, I had a passion for research from a very early childhood. And that continued right through my college days and through medical school. Most people opt for clinical practice. I would have loved to have been able to combine clinical work with teaching and research, but such opportunities are quite rare in India. And I was committed to staying in India after my training. I wanted to be back in India and work in India. And so I was lucky that I found a position in a research institute in the ICMR system that allowed me to really undertake high quality research, while at the same time I had the opportunity to look after patients. And though I'm a pediatrician, I did take care of both adults and children. And at the time that I was in my mid-career was the time when HIV and TB became a big problem in India. It really needed a lot of focus. There was very little known about it other than South Africa, Southern Africa. This problem, we had the biggest burden of HIV and TB in India. So it offered a whole new area of to explore and to document a lot of things, which then helped in the treatment and also in the policy making for HIV and TB. And that was a very satisfying part. But yes, my passion for research came from early childhood, probably just imbibed because of the environment but it continued. I think it continued to fascinate me. And my parents always allowed us to have our own decision making. There was never any kind of a positive or negative influence on the path that we wanted to follow. It was entirely up to us. What they did do was provide the environment for us to explore and also question and get more information on what we needed, and have an open mind always.
That's actually very terrific to hear, because I'm sure at that time, this I don't know what it was, like with your friends and other colleagues, peers your age, were women really being encouraged to go into science as a profession, to have an open mind, to sort of think, as you said, you had the freedom to think and make your choices. And do you think that that was something that was really unique to the way you were brought up, you and your sisters were brought up?
Yes, I think in a way it was, if not unique, it was, I think, uncommon to have. We never, while growing up, ever realized that we were girls versus boys, and that there were things that we could or could not do. That was never a consideration for us. And so for us, the world was open, just as it would have been for boys of our age growing up. And so whether it was mountaineering that my sister wanted to do, it was never about, oh, you can't do it because you're a girl, or it's an unsafe thing for you to do. So I think that definitely helped us in, but also I must say that we were very fortunate to be in that kind of environment where not only was it very academic and focus always, on dialogue and debate and very thoughtful conversations, but also that it was pragmatic, realistic. As I said, we traveled to villages. We knew what rural life was like. We knew that the urban poor had a very different lifestyle than our own, with their own needs and considerations. And that we also had exposure to we traveled quite a lot. And so we knew that even within India, there were so many different cultures and ways of life and living and beliefs. And we learned to be quite adaptable and adjustable as well. So I think all of those helped us in decision making. But I think it was always a dialogue where if we asked for advice, we were given different options, or just basically asked questions back to make us think for ourselves rather than being told what to do.
When you sort of, finally got into, you reached the top of the sort of position in the ICMR, for example, the Indian Council for Medical Research. Now, what was that like for you as a woman, if I could ask you? And I ask this because even today, women across the board, in whatever profession we're in, women may be better qualified, they may be better at doing their jobs than men are, but we still face, whether it's disparity in pay or the way we are treated in our office environments, etc. What was that like for you, and the sort of environment in a very male dominated science community?
So one thing is that in the medical sciences and the life sciences in general, it's the male female ratio is not too bad at all. And so unlike maybe if you take physics or mathematics or astronomy, so you don't feel always that you're in a very tiny minority. However, the more senior you become, the more and more you find that the other people in the room are men, and that you may be one of the minority of women. And certainly as you start getting to the levels of being a secretary to the government of India or being a director general by CMR, there were I was often, completely outnumbered by men in the room. So it is a little intimidating, and particularly when I was a younger scientist, I found it quite intimidating, not only because there's a male-female imbalance, but also I think in India there is, because many of our institutions are based in Delhi and surroundings, you often find many of the expert committees and so on, the meetings that take place are dominated by people from Delhi or the surroundings, or certainly the north. And I've heard many experts from South India often say that they never heard or never invited, or, so I think it's both. It was having been based in the South, in Chennai for many years, of course, being a Tamilian myself, but having grown up in the North, I considered myself as much a North Indian, an Indian, in fact. I never classify myself as any type of Indian. But this is what I've heard from my colleagues, that experts, from the South are often not visible and their voices are not as. So I think in India, because we're so large and so heterogeneous, there has to be a very concerted and a very specific and determined effort whenever we constitute what should be a nationally representative committee, that we need to look at not only gender balance, we need to look at geographic representation. That's something I've learned at the WHO, because every WHO committee that's set up, the first thing we look at is geographic diversity and gender balance before any committee is approved. So this is very important also for a country like India.
Is it true that you initially wanted to become a veterinarian, that because of your love for animals? So
Yeah.
how did it change from becoming wanting to become a vet to where you are now?
So yes, first I wanted to be a vet. Then I wanted to be a basic scientist. I wanted to be a geneticist. And so somewhere through my pre-medical year, which was my first year in Hindu college, doing BSc zoology, is when all of my classmates, literally every single one of them, was going to appear for the medical entrance exam. And at that point, having spoken to a few, older people, get advice, they felt that my fascination for genetics could still be taken forward after doing medicine. You can still branch into basic research and science, neuroscience, for example. So that's how I got into medical school. And it was just a one-off chance. I applied only to AFMC and I got in, because otherwise I said this is the way that my fate can be decided. I try for one medical school, and if fate wants me to be a doctor, then I'll be a doctor. Otherwise, I carry on with my pure sciences, taking the BSc, MSc, PhD pathway. But once I joined medical school, I found clinical medicine extremely fascinating and interesting. I didn't want to go away from it and back to the bench. And so that's how I wanted to have both clinical medicine, but also pursue science by doing clinical research, basically.
You've had this incredible career, and you have your own family. So can I ask you what women still ask me, which is that, can women have it all? How difficult has it been for you to do the whole work-life balance thing? Or easy?
Yes, I mean, I do think that women have to prove them, even today, that women do have to work harder to prove themselves. If there are two people, a man and a woman at the same stage, it's also because women are less likely to push themselves forward, and your work has to speak for itself. But the other factor which we have to recognize is that women do have, I think, a disproportionate burden of home care, child care, relatives care, elderly parents care. All of that does end up falling more on the woman than on the man. While things are changing, I think more men are taking those responsibilities, or sharing them at least. I think it's still disproportionate on women. And so it does become at some point quite challenging to balance that career and home. I think I did it only because I had a very supportive, I have a very supportive partner, as well as a family environment where I had help and I could focus on my career. But at the same time, I would say that I did not neglect the family or my children. I always made it a point to have that balance. And I think that's something that we have to do, because otherwise we're going to regret it later on.
Well, I'll come back to some more questions about your personal journey in a while, and shift focus to the pandemic, because I know, as I said, a lot of people have logged on today to hear what you have to say on that. Can I begin by asking you about the global pace of vaccination? When you look at where some of the world's leading countries are at as far as vaccines are concerned, how do you think we're doing? And then I'll come to India, but overall, how do you think we're doing with vaccines?
Well, I think where we've done really well is in the development and approval of so many vaccines. I mean, currently, I think there are about 20 vaccines being used in different parts of the world. I mean, that itself is incredible. And today, I think I looked at the number, 3.8 billion doses of vaccines have been, so almost 4 billion doses of vaccine have been administered worldwide. If only those doses could have been given to people in all countries who are the most vulnerable, at the highest risk of dying, we could have by this time stopped or significantly reduced the number of people dying of COVID. However, what we find ourselves in a situation where cases and deaths are rising in almost every region in the world, and about 8 to 10,000 people are dying every day, even today when we have vaccines. So that is what makes the situation very sad, in that while science delivered what it had to, the vaccines were developed in record time and approved and have largely proven to be very effective, very safe. That is an incredible achievement, and it's also luck, because it's not true for all viruses, and it just happens that this virus has an immune response that allows us to make effective vaccines. But we didn't use that as a global community. We did not say, okay, let the vaccines go to every country to immunize healthcare workers, frontline workers, elderly in that order, so that we protect them. And then let's vaccinate the rest of the adult population. So what we're seeing now is, yes, in some countries, deaths have come down dramatically. The economies are reopening. People are going back to normal life.
There's inequity, clearly. I mean, what you're saying is that there's clearly, yes, the developed countries are obviously they've hoarded, in a sense, the vaccines in the initial months, and there are large parts of the world that still don't have them.
I won't use the word hoarded. I mean, they have been vaccinating their people. I don't think anybody is sitting on big stockpiles of vaccines, but yes, they have prioritized their own populations rather than taking a more global approach.
How do you look at India's vaccination drive then? The government here has set a very ambitious target of vaccinating all adults by the end of this year. But when we look at the average daily numbers of vaccines in India, we're still very, very short of that mark. We're about more than 5 million vaccines short every single day. On the average, I think last week was about 3.8 million a day. And I believe we have to hit about 8.8 million a day to vaccinate 60% of the adult population. So are you concerned that that India's vaccination pace is too slow, or are you hopeful that this may pick up in the last quarter of the year?
So I think what's the determining factor here seems to be the supply of vaccines.
Yes.
India does have the capacity to scale up to a much higher rate of vaccination every day. We've seen, occasionally on some days you do see up to 6 million vaccines being delivered. So I think as the supply start increasing, which they should from next month, as more vaccines are made available, that the pace of vaccination will pick up. But yes, I mean, it's a huge challenge. I think India has done well so far. We've, delivered more than, I think, 450 million doses of vaccine, but our population is huge and everyone has to get a second dose. So this is where I think the challenge is. But it may not be possible by the end of the year, but I do think the pace will pick up significantly from, say, August onwards. That's if the projected supplies all come through.
We're going to open this question and answer session to some of our participants now. But before we do that, when you look at the UK, for example, Dr. Swaminathan, which has decided to, in a sense, completely open up now, and even mask wearing is not compulsory. We're all watching what happens there because they have a large section of their population which is double vaccinated now. It may not be enough, but it's certainly a lot more than many other countries. So how closely are you watching the UK? I mean, we've seen in the last few days that their daily cases have come down. The graph is going down, but fingers are crossed. And do you think that the UK, in a sense, will be a test case of how life can sort of go back to somewhat normal?
Yeah, I mean, the UK has had a very successful vaccination program, very smooth. They have a huge percentage, and particularly the vulnerable groups. They're very high coverage. They have no vaccine hesitancy. So that's been really good. And yes, in a way, it was a test to see what happens when the economy opens up. Luckily, the cases seem to have stabilized or come down. Hospitalizations are not increasing significantly. And I think a large part is due to the public actually being well informed and taking precautions, because that is key to keeping infections down. Because however high the vaccination coverage, you still have a significant proportion of people unvaccinated and capable of both getting and transmitting the infection. So I think it speaks to people being cautious themselves and not basically, going out there and throwing all precautions to the winds. So that is a good lesson. We are watching that very carefully, but also watching other countries. But what is clear is when you look at cases rising in, as I said, all regions today, cases are rising in all WHO regions, but the deaths are not rising, obviously, in countries with high vaccination coverage. And so that's where you have different responses and what the DG has often called like the diverging pandemic, where deaths and hospitalizations are very low in the high income countries, whereas when cases rise, deaths rise in most other countries where vaccine coverage is still low.
So vaccination does hold the key. We've got Prachi Sharma, who's on the panel. Prachi, you have a question for Dr. Swaminathan. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nidhi ma'am. Hello and good evening, Dr. Soumya ma'am. I feel lucky and privileged to have this opportunity to interact with you. So my question is that since the vaccination run has not yet begun for the younger population, that is the children, so what do you think, like what effect could COVID-19 have on them in near future? And how do you guide and suggest to protect our children, make them more stronger immunity wise, and how do we stop this? How do we come back to the normal?
Yeah, thank you, Prachi, for that question. Let me say that the impact on children and young people, I think, has been huge, more than what we've recognized. There are many studies now looking both at the impact on, the interruptions in education, as well as the impact on nutrition for those children who depended on midday meals and things like that. At one point we had something like 1.6 billion children out of school. Now we still have hundreds of millions of children out of school in many countries. Children need to be prioritized. It's about their education, but it's also about other things, the cognitive and psychological and the mental health impacts of the pandemic. There's been so much of uncertainty, and there's been a huge gap now in in-person schooling. And so this is the time to actually develop a strategy for how we're going to bring children back into school. Many countries kept schools open. So many countries prioritized schooling over everything else. And I really applaud those countries for doing that. Switzerland, where I am, is one of them, but many others, including the UK. And it was shown clearly that the outbreaks did not happen in schools. The children, if were getting infected, but they were getting infected within their families, and sometimes could bring it and spread it to other children. But schools were not the source of infection in majority of studies that have been done so far. But of course, you have adults and children mixing there, and there's always that opportunity. Now that many adults, or most adults, hopefully teachers are treated as frontline workers, school workers should be treated as frontline workers and vaccinated. Children, even if they get the infection, they don't get ill. We've seen now in the sero surveys done in India that the same number of children, over 60% of children, also have evidence of antibodies, which means the same proportion of children and adults have been infected. Clearly, it was not due to schools, because schools have remained closed for the last 1.5 years in India. So going to school is not going to cause a risk to children. I think we have to prioritize. We also have to think about how they'll catch up for the last 1.5 years of missed education, and which classes are they going to go to, how are they going to progress, what additional coaching and tuition, etc., is going to be needed, particularly for children in government schools who don't have the possibility of having access to online education. So I think you've raised a very important issue. I wouldn't worry about the health impacts. I certainly wouldn't wait for children to get vaccinated before they go back to school.
I think
That
that's
would be
very important. Many educationists here in India are pushing for that as well. Unfortunately, we have not prioritized education at all. It's the reverse, it's sort of the last on the priority list. Lavanya, you have your question for Dr. Soumya. Please go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. So my question is, how do we get into the WHO or the United Nations, and what a student has to do for it? What is the criteria?
Okay, a career in the WHO. How do you do that? Work really hard.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I think you have to work really hard. You have to be a specialist in your subject. So it's not like the moment you finish your first degree that you want to try and get into WHO. There are opportunities like internships and some fellowships. In fact, WHO is launching a new fellowship program for people from the lower income countries to come and have an exposure for a year or 2 years. But those are more limited experiences. So I think the main thing is you have to specialize in what you are doing, and you have to really be an expert, and you have to have ground level practical experience. The best way to get into WHO is to prove that you know your work and that you've made a mark in your field. And then you can come in either to serve on these expert advisory committees. We have hundreds of them. And it's very rewarding to be on a WHO expert advisory committee, because these are global committees and your recommendations have a lot of impact. But of course, then also applying for a job, when the vacancy arises, you'll see if you match, the
Criteria.
requirements and criteria, and then apply. But I think initially one has to focus on your career and your passion and be good at what you're doing.
Nihit has a question for you, Dr. Soumya. Nihit, are you there?
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity, ma'am. And hi, ma'am, this is Nihit here. I hope you're doing well. My question to you is regarding the vaccine hesitancy that you spoke of regarding the UK case, but I see a large survey by the Morning Consult, which is doing every week a survey which says that the vaccine hesitancy is increasing a bit, especially in the West, in the parts of US, but it is decreasing in the East. So the hindrances that come from the perceived religious and cultural gurus of some camps advise their people publicly, stating that not to take vaccines. So do you think, is it the alone reason, or do you think that there is any trust deficit that exists between some sections of society and the larger sections of public institutions like government or scientific committees or bodies? This question comes from a context where I see large gatherings of people at some village claiming to take a dosage of the perceived indigenous herbal medicine, ignoring all the scientific norms, and the medicine is which is untested and unproved. So how do we address this vaccine hesitancy?
That's a good
Thank you.
question, because, Dr. Soumya, we see that, I mean, it's, the wonderful thing called the WhatsApp forward, where, people have been sent videos that, all misinformation about what a vaccine may do to you and your health, etc. This is a big challenge for an organization like yours, for the WHO, isn't it? To deal with this misinformation, which is a pandemic by itself.
Exactly. And we call it the infodemic. And we have a whole program of work on how to address the infodemic. I think this is the first pandemic we've had in the social media era. And as you said, the social media is being used both for good, but also unfortunately to spread misinformation and rumors and so on. And so we worked a lot with tech companies to actually try to highlight and pull off anything which is classified as misinformation or rumors or false. So we have a group that's constantly monitoring the social media platforms and highlighting, but it's a huge task. And there are very well designed programs that spread this kind of anti-vaccine, anti-science messages. It's a very big task. To come back to the question on vaccine hesitancy, I think one has to be very context specific. There's no global, it's not a global problem, and there's no global solutions. I think we need to look, even within Europe, you can see huge differences country to country on vaccine acceptance. So in India, again, being a large and heterogeneous country, we need to go state by state, probably, and we need to have surveys, as you talked about, frequent surveys. We need to involve the social and behavioral scientists when we design surveys, because sometimes it's the qualitative responses that give you much more information. And then our campaigns need to be based on what the public is thinking and doing and saying. And also it's important, you raised the issue of trust. It's very important that the messages come from people whom the community trusts. And this could be different in different communities. So in remote tribal communities, maybe it's the leader, the headman of that village, or it could be even the person who dispenses these herbal remedies. So we'll have to work with those kind of people. During the polio campaign, religious leaders played an important role in convincing some communities to accept the polio drops. So India has done a lot of innovative things in immunization programs in the past. And we need to use that local intelligence, and our campaigns need to be based on that. But it's, I think, really important to address. A lot of people have genuine questions about the vaccines, and those we need to be able to address them very transparently and openly about how a particular vaccine was developed, how it was given approval, what kind of studies were done, what data we have, and also on the side effects, the potential and the actual side effects that are occurring. How are we monitoring them? How are we reporting them? What action is being taken? And what can people do if they get a side effect? I think all of these absolutely genuine questions need to be addressed. But then, of course, there's that whole area of misinformation, which can only be cleared up by communication from a trusted source.
Ma'am, if I could ask you, how is the data on Covaxin looking to you? I know that the WHO is in the process of looking at its application for approval. So, but based on the data they have submitted, is it looking good? A lot of Indians are concerned with the fact that it's yet to get the WHO's nod, and there are students, for example, who've been told in US universities that they would have to come there and then, take Pfizer or Moderna or something else because it's not recognized yet. But I think it would set a lot of minds at ease if we could know your initial feedback on the data, if you could share that.
So I'm not on the committee that reviews the data, so I really can't comment. I've only seen what's in the public domain, and it looks very encouraging, the data. But this is not the WHO's position that I'm talking about. What I do know is that I think the data submission was completed about a week ago. It's a huge data package that the experts will be looking at. And then the technical advisory group will meet to review that data package and see if it is, if everything has been satisfied and that they can go ahead and provide the emergency use listing. And that's probably going to take a couple of weeks. I think normally, this process actually takes months, but because of the pandemic, it's all been expedited, and the committee comes back usually in a matter of a couple of weeks. But it again depends on the completeness of the data submission, the dossier, and whether there are additional questions that the committee will ask the company to provide more details on. So there could be some back and forth which happens. So I can't really give you a timeline, but I was told by the group that does it here that hopefully it should be done in the month of August.
Okay, so we'll keep our fingers crossed. We have a couple of more questions before we start winding down. Madhavi, if you're there, please go ahead with your question. I'm so glad to see so many women asking questions today. Madhavi. I don't know if Madhavi is there yet. Hopefully she'll come on soon. But until then, can I ask you about, this whole issue of vaccine passports, and, when we can see some semblance of being able to travel internationally again. Again, there's been some controversy because, there are some vaccines that are recognized by some countries, others don't recognize them. For example, many of us didn't understand why, if the WHO has a list of vaccines that are approved by all of you, why the EU's medicines agency needs to have a separate list. So there was that whole thing about Covishield and AstraZeneca. Do you think vaccine passports are going to be the future of travel, or do you believe they're discriminatory? How do you see them?
Yeah, thanks, Nidhi. I think the WHO has been very clear that we do not recommend the use of vaccine passports for as the sole document to enable travel. that it would be discriminatory, and that because people across the world do not have equal access to the vaccine, that this should not be. So I think what the EU did was they said you can travel either with a certificate of vaccination or with a negative PCR test or with a certificate that you have recovered from COVID in the last 6 months. So there are these 3 criteria based on which you can have entry, which is fine. Now, for the citizens of the European Union, they issued a guideline to use this vaccination certificate, or they call it, I think, a digital green pass or something like that, because it will enable easy crossing of borders for residents of the EU. Now, the EMA has only approved 4 vaccines, and these are the 4 vaccines that apply to the European Medicines Agency because they're going to be used
Marketed.
in Europe.
Yeah.
Others are in process of applying and being considered. But now what we are aware is that about 15 countries have accepted all the vaccines on the WHO EUL, including Covishield. And we are working with countries and the European Commission to see that all countries accept the WHO EUL vaccines, because that clearly is a mark of quality. And it would really help if we had this uniform. So again, this is another example of an area where the WHO has guidance. If all countries followed, it would be easy, but not all countries are following the same policies. So I'm hoping that within the next, I know that students particularly are very anxious because of this, and it's also very confusing. So we will continue to work with the member states to see that there's some kind of standardization in the approach.
What's it been like for you? And have you been able to see your family at all in the last year and a half?
Not as much as I would like to. Obviously, the workload is extremely heavy, and it continues to be, because now we have new areas of work. I'm also leading the work on establishing the mRNA technology transfer hubs, the first one in South Africa, but there are going to be more, because we think mRNA technology is really something that for the future, not only for COVID, but for many other diseases, can really provide huge opportunities in both vaccines and therapeutics. So that's something that I would like to focus on in the coming months, even while handling the other issues. So it's been very challenging and humbling experience for me, but I've really been very fortunate. I feel fortunate to have been in a position to contribute and also to be part of an amazing team of colleagues. And it's really teamwork. WHO is all about teamwork. And you may see one face more than you see others, but there's a huge team behind, doing all the work. So it's been a journey that's, I think, unforgettable.
So I have a question that I think is on a lot of people's minds, which is, how long will this pandemic last? If you had to crystal gaze into your crystal ball, are we potentially looking at the next few years as being a sort of new normal or an altered normal? I don't know how to put it.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think a lot of the answers up to us in the sense of up to human beings on how we do things and how we agree to move forward. The first thing I would say is that the virus isn't going away. It's clearly here to stay. So it's going to become another respiratory virus, and we'll have to see whether it stays on as a mild thing that causes, if a lot of people have immunity, then possibly it could be circulating as another coronavirus. We already have several in circulation that causes some respiratory illness, but is not causing a lot of morbidity and deaths. I hope that by the end of this year that we would have vaccinated enough people in every country. Our goal is, the DG has talked about 40% vaccination coverage by the end of the year. But even if we get to say 30%, we should be in a position where we have largely reduced deaths, brought deaths down to a bare minimum. Health systems can start functioning, essential health services should get back to normal, economies can open up. Then, of course, you expand vaccination coverage for the rest of the adult population, maybe ultimately children also. But I think if we can protect those who are most likely to die or get very ill from getting infection by the end of the year, we can start getting back to some degree of normality. Now, when you say normality, it's not like we go back to pre-pandemic. we will have to maintain precautions. We will have to continue to probably mask for some time and do other things. The testing and other things will have to be kept up. But at least, education institutions can start functioning. Other
Some of us
establishments.
miss travel, just to be able to travel the world, and just we used to take these things for granted, the smallest things, and look how life has changed. Finally, Dr. Soumya, if I could ask you something that perhaps our students could learn something from, how would you define success, and what would you advise them they could learn from failure, because it happens to all of us? So how do you look at success and failure, and how do you define success in your view?
Well, success is very subjective, and I don't know if I can come up with one definition that will fit all. It also depends on your perspective. It depends on the viewer, really, whose position you're looking at from, whose point of view you're taking. And there's also personal definition of success, I think, for everyone. So you could, and it could be something very small or it could be something very big. So I think what's important is for us, each individual, and particularly students, to really think about what your goals are in life, what you would like to do, what your passion is, have a plan for how you would like to get there. Of course, there are many things that happen when you plan something. Things don't always go according to the plan. Things don't always go right. And so you have to, you always learn from failures. I've realized that when you are in the midst of a failure, it just feels like it's the worst possible thing could have happened to you, and that you're the one who's suffering, and as opposed to everyone else, and that you'll never find a way out. But when you've come through it, and of course it helps to have friends and family supporting you when you're in those dark moments, but when you're through it, you look back, you always learn something, and those lessons help you, in the future. So for me, I think I would say the ingredients to success are, firstly, to be dedicated to what you're doing, to really have a passion for what you're doing and to follow your passion and your interest. Secondly, is to believe in teamwork. I don't think that any of us can be successful by ourselves. And I've found that, if you build a good team, then the likelihood of success is much better. And thirdly, I think, is listening. I think one of the qualities of good leadership is to be able to listen to people and take on board what other people are, their views, and internalizing that and incorporating it into your decision making.
All right. Well, it was really wonderful to talk to you, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I know this is an incredibly difficult and a busy time for you and for the WHO. So we really appreciate that you took out the time to speak to us, to our students, our faculty, and keep doing what you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, ma'am. Bye.